Welcome to the next episode of the Mental Playbook with Christine Dalgety. I have a guest today, and I'll talk about her in 1 second. Today we're talking about childhood anxiety and all that is childhood anxiety and how parents can help. Yeah, it's prevalent right now, and we're going to dive into it. I want to welcome Jade. Jade is one of my psychotherapists at Dalgety Counseling and Psychotherapy. She's been with me since, which I need to correct because my last podcast I said she'd been with me since May of 2000. I think she was about 5. She's been with me since May of 2020, right in the height of the pandemic. And we didn't actually see each other face to face for about the first 2 months or so because we were working from home. Jade is a registered psychotherapist. She is a certified Canadian counselor and a clinical supervisor, both for the College of Psychotherapists and for the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association.
Yep, nailed it.
I'm not part of that one. And Jade's specialty is children and youth. And she's a bit of a rock star in our area on all the mom social media pages. You have to see Jade Ferguson. I take credit for it, but you know. She is a rock star. She's amazing. And she also specializes in trauma for adults and children using eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. So welcome, Jade.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. She's my right-hand lady. And I always joke that she's kind of my mini-me. We are very similar in the way we think and the way we treat people. So just a brief overview. Today we're going to talk about childhood anxiety, the impact it has on children, families, schools, education, the children mostly. And as you know, because you are pretty full, Jade's also having a baby, her first child, so she's abandoning me in August, and she will be missed. But yeah, I mean, you see your clientele, your roster's full, and it's mostly children. And so you see day to day what the impact that it has.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit, and you know these, maybe not the specific stats, but I think that it's really important when we talk about, when we use statistics, because I think that people don't truly understand, especially the difference between 2019 and today, and how the last few years have impacted children.
Yeah.
And, as you know, children go through different developmental milestones, and a lot of children and youth missed those milestones during the pandemic because of isolation, social distancing, not being in school, that kind of thing. My brother and I were talking because my niece was in grade 9 when it started, and by the time they had a full uninterrupted school year, I think she was finishing grade 11 or starting grade 12. And he said she's going into grade 12 and has never gone to a high school party or anything. Yeah. Right? So, which I guess is a little bit reassuring for parents when they're not going to those parties and stuff. But all those things, just the social, and I know that I noticed it personally, but also here with some of the teenagers that I saw that, in grade 12, they were kind of, the social dynamic were like grade 9, grade 8 level, because that's how old they were when this all started.
Yeah, and the same kind of contrast too, like if you think about a child who started in junior kindergarten or senior kindergarten, and then the end of the pandemic they're in grade 3 or 4, like that's a huge developmental span that they've missed out on so many pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah. And social development, and even infants, like toddlers. My grandson was born during the pandemic, during 2020, and everyone had masks on. Yeah. And he was not subjected to socialization, right? And so babies can't see the initial facial expressions and stuff like that because of masks. And I think he was like 18 months old before he went to watch my son play broomball and in an arena, and my daughter-in-law was like, he was just like, because he was around mostly family other than daycare. Yeah. Craziness. So StatsCan, Statistics Canada, did some surveys and compared from when they did it in 2019 and then they redid them in 2023. it was mostly teens that because they did do children, but it was more parent.
Mm.
And not dissing Stotts can, but I just think that it's a parent's perspective then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a child's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So they did 5 to 9 year olds, but they interviewed the parents, not the kids.
Yeah.
So, but in 2019, youth aged 12 to 17 years, so they were doing like how they rated their mental health. And 12% rated their mental health as fair or poor.
Mm-hmm.
In 2023, that more than doubled. It was 26%.
Mm-hmm.
Which it doesn't surprise us because we
Mm-hmm.
see it all the time, but it is like it more than doubled.
Yeah.
So at that point, then they were age 16 to 21.
Right.
And about 1 in 5 youth who felt their mental health was good or better in 2019 no longer felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
1 in 5.
Mm-hmm.
Some other patterns that I saw when I was looking up some statistics, which I know that we've talked briefly about, was how, some of these statistics government projected, and I'm not going to get all political or anything because that's not who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But they were doing statistics in children's mental health, and they were showing that emergency department visits were down 31%, and they were highlighting that. And children being hospitalized for mental health and other reasons, but this one was for mental health, was down 23%.
Mm-hmm.
And they're highlighting that, like, look at what's happening. We all know that when you go to the emergency department today, even in our small town, you're looking at 8 to 10 hour wait.
Mm-hmm.
People aren't wanting to do that.
Yeah.
We know in our profession, healthcare right now, people are not being hospitalized. Kids
Mm-hmm.
are not being hospitalized because of the lack of resources
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing. It's not
Mm-hmm.
the fault of the professionals working with them, which then leads me to. So we look at that as a decrease. However, physician visits, so going to your doctor, was up 8%.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the part that, right? I believe that if somebody's brain is not functioning optimally and they need medication, then yes. However, I don't like to see kids overly medicated,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially with psychotropic.
Mm-hmm.
Antipsychotic medication because
Mm-hmm.
of their developing brain.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not judging because I'm not, doctors are going to make their best decisions. But medications, administration of medications for mood and anxiety was up 18% in the last few years. And antipsychotic medication is up 13%.
Mm-hmm.
So my perspective is, yeah, those crisis situations may be down, but medicating kids is up.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm kind of interpreting that as they're trying to get support, they're going to their family physician, but then this is where the gap is that they're not being referred to the supports that might be the most
Mm-hmm.
helpful for them in that moment, whether that's psychotherapy, whether that's a pediatrician, whether that's whatever. And so they get introduced to medication, and that might help somewhat. But we also want to be able to hopefully give them tools and strategies to be able to navigate the challenges with or without that pharmaceutical help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so when you say like the gap when they need it,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that doctors aren't referring,
Mm-hmm.
it's that they could wait a month or so before they get.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I also think too, like we've experienced, but the support isn't necessarily there unless there is a significant crisis. And even at that,
Yeah.
there's not. So that makes it very difficult too. People feel a little lost.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And parents don't know what to do. If
Exactly.
There's a crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we could go on for days
Yeah.
with this. But I want to move on. I want to move on to some more education, like what anxiety is. And so the episode is going to be about, what childhood anxiety is, what it looks like, the symptoms, how you can see it in your children, how you can support your children, looking at the root causes, how it's misinterpreted sometimes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. You
Mhm.
cool with that?
Sounds good to me.
All right. anxiety, childhood anxiety, any anxiety, is every child may feel anxious, right? It's when it's interfering. So anxiety motivates us, right? It motivates us to get things done. It motivates kids to get their schoolwork done and stuff like that. But when it's interfering with school, with extracurriculars, with social, with sleep, with eating, with, then it's disordered.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's when they come to see you.
Yeah.
Not me anymore, because I'm getting old and I don't have the energy for it. So I get all you youngins.
Yeah.
All right. So can you talk a little bit about, different types of anxiety that you treat?
Yeah. So there's a couple of pieces, and just kind of going off of what you said, like, I do think that anxiety in children is characterized by like the avoidance, right? Like wanting to avoid school or the extracurriculars, eating, sleeping, what have you. So yeah, there's a couple of different disorders that might come up. So there's like generalized anxiety disorder, which is, that excessive worry or fear about kind of the day-to-day things. And it can vary from school to family to, whatever it might be. We see separation anxiety, so that's a pretty intense fear and concern about being apart from caregivers. And then we can also see some social anxiety pieces. So, again, an intense fear about being around new people or large crowds of people. And a common kind of dynamic within all three of those is that unpredictability, right? The not knowing. And that's often what kids can kind of feel stuck with or can hyper focus on, and where we see a lot of the like what if thoughts.
Yeah.
And whether again it's related to something general, whether it's related to parents, whether it's related to that social piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, expanding on the general anxiety, I think in today's day and age, like when I was growing up, if something happened in the States or something happened, like if there was, a tragedy in the States, I would see it in the newspaper maybe 3 or 4 days later, and it would be like a police car with caution tape, and it might say, school shooting or whatever it happened to be. Yeah. Now kids are watching everything real time.
Absolutely. There's kids that I work with that talk about things that I like are very adult topics because they've been exposed to it via social media, peers at school, again, family, what have you. And so that just feeds their anxiety, unfortunately, sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean the state of our world right now, and kids are getting all this information, and their brains are not developed enough. I mean, I don't understand some of the stuff that goes on, and I have a developed brain, right? So I can't, how kids interpret it, and just hearing bits and pieces from parents talking and stuff like that too, and everything that goes on. I mean, I'm on social media and I turn it on and I scroll. But if I'm a kid, right, it'd be like, holy cow, and they go to worst case scenarios. So that's creating a lot of generalized anxiety too.
Absolutely.
And the social anxiety as well. I worked with kids for 20 some years before I started backing away. And I still have some, right? And I see the perfectionism, because social anxiety, part of that is fear of judgment, needing to be perfect, that kind of thing. And I see a lot of that, like part of that, like when I was working with kids and I had like kids that worked on an assignment for hours, and there was one little thing and they erased it all and started over. And I do have social anxiety, and I do have that perfectionism. Obviously, as I get older, it's not as bad. So I remember being like that, but like that is paralyzing for kids, right?
Absolutely.
They're up all night, working on these things, and that's just one snippet. It's not all of the schoolwork and all of the athletics and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like you said, they go into the worst case scenario, right? That if I don't correct this, what's going to be the outcome? Is my teacher going to be mad or what have you? Yeah,
I had one client years ago, and it was like, it went from a grade 9 quiz. I said, what's the worst thing that can happen? We ended up being single, alone, and on the streets. Because she wouldn't be able to get into university, and she wouldn't be able to do academic level courses, and and this quiz was worth maybe 0.5% of her final mark. But she was convinced of that, and that's what the brain does.
Yeah, the more we think about something, the more we start to believe it.
Absolutely. And the limbic system can't say that's real danger and that's perceived. That's for another podcast. I think that we often talk about how anxiety manifests in adults, right? Yeah. How do you see it manifesting in children? I mean, they have that underdeveloped brain. So the prefrontal cortex, so the rational thinking part is underdeveloped.
Yeah.
So what do you see in your office?
Yeah, so a lot of times with kids, anxiety presents through like physical symptoms. So like stomach aches, so complaining about they don't feel good, whether that's again before bed, at school, headaches, even sometimes like when something's really sore, right? They have a sore arm or a sore leg and they're looking for essentially that feedback from a caregiver, right? Yeah. To say like I need something, but they're not really sure how to communicate that. So a lot through those physical symptoms, and then avoidance, so not wanting to do things, not wanting to go to school or to socialize with the people they usually do or the extracurriculars. Those are kind of two big ones. And then, you know, we could also talk about it presents in these like meltdowns, like really significant experiences of emotion where it's hard, parents find it hard to kind of console them or regulate them. Mm-hmm. So kind of that, you know, over or disproportionate response to whatever the situation is.
For sure. One thing I hear all the time is, yeah, but they said they wanted to do it. Desire's there.
Absolutely.
Right? I want to go to taekwondo. I want to go to soccer, and then they get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because they say they want to do it doesn't mean they can do it.
Yeah.
Right? Still have to give them the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think that's a big part too, like, you know, when it comes to, and we'll talk about this later, I guess, but strategies, right? Like we're not wanting to kind of not engage with the thing that's really anxiety provoking, but find ways to support them so that they can do the things that they want to do, but in a way that's manageable for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was, you know, I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today and everything, and thinking about my time working with kids and everything and the misconceptions that happen. And first I'll share one that I saw a lot because I worked in the education system for 24 years before I started my private practice. And a big one was like, that education staff would say to me was one situation in particular. One of the students that I worked with, his anxiety manifested into anger, those emotional outbursts. And which, you know, I did a video on last week that anger is to protect us. And so we might have those emotional outbursts because we want people to back off because we're feeling overwhelmed. And so this child we'd have to clear the classroom and and a staff member said to me, yeah, everyone keeps using anxiety. That's not anxiety. He's like trying to get attention on himself and he's trying to. And I looked at this, I'm like, that is absolutely anxiety. But this misperception that we have that anxiety means the shy kid, the ones that's just like sitting, like, no, not necessarily. So do you have any experiences with stuff like that or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good misconception that a lot of times, when we think about anxiety, it's the withdrawn, the quiet, but kind of going off of that, we have to think about, in particular with kids, like behavior is communication. So if there's something atypical behavior-wise that they're demonstrating, we want to be curious about that.
For sure.
Because they're trying to communicate something, and you know, typically it's that they're feeling unsafe or scared or angry, anxious, whatever the emotion is. Some other misconceptions, would be that common phrase like, oh, they're overreacting, right? Like they're overreacting to the situation, where yes, their response might be, as I had said earlier, disproportionate, but to them, their emotions are real and valid and true in that moment. We might not understand it as adults or parents or caregivers in that situation or agree with it even, but it doesn't excuse the fact that that's still how your child is feeling or how the child is feeling in that moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you go back to what we've been talking about with the prefrontal cortex, right? You know, I often say to parents, the girl drama is a big one. And people forget what they were like when they were 12 and 13 years old. But part of that is, I say to parents, just because you think that it's ridiculous because she talked to Sally and not me today, to that child's brain and the developmental stage that brain is at, that is a big deal. So support that child through that. Don't laugh at them or say, oh, you know, and think they're overreacting to the situation.
Yeah. And I think that also ties into that another misconception of like, oh, they'll get over it, right? Like it'll just go away, or they're fine. Like some, again, like almost a dismissive approach, right? Versus like validating that that's how they feel in that moment. Because for them in that moment, it's, again, real for them.
Yeah, and hearing, and we will get into strategies, but hearing you're being silly, or it's going to be fine. You know, how do you know it's going to be fine? Adult brain, it's going to be fine. Child brain, you don't know that. And if something happens that it's not fine, they don't trust you anymore.
And in that moment for them, it doesn't feel fine.
No.
So it's not fine for them in that moment.
Absolutely. And, you know, I often say to adults, kind of getting off topic here, but that's kind of what I do sometimes. I often say to adults, you know, what is your fear? What is your phobia? So let's say it's snakes, right? If I told you to go and pick up that snake, would you? And adults are like, no. Okay, why not? How do you know it's going to bite you? How do you know it's poisonous? Just pick it up. You're not going to know until you pick it up. You know, toughen up. Those kinds of things that we say to adults and children. Try to look at it that way. If it's a garter snake or something, it's not going to hurt you, but that's your fear, right? Me saying it'll be fine, just pick it up, is not going to make you go and snuggle with the snake.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, like, fear is a normal part of childhood, and anxiety is a normal part of childhood, so we need to acknowledge that and kind of let them be okay with that, but again, supporting them in doing that.
For sure. And the other thing is too that a lot of people think that anxiety is overused. The term anxiety is overused. B, that people use anxiety for attention-seeking behaviors, and I can tell you that in my experience, no child wants to melt down in front of their peers, not enjoy activities and that sort of thing, and want to be the center of attention in those ways, right? I used to say to teachers, no child wants to be a sobbing, snotty mess on the floor in front of their peers or other adults.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's maybe even something too that as adults we don't understand, but you know, after they experience those meltdowns or tantrums, there's a lot of emotion attached to that too, embarrassment, shame, etc. So if there's a way they can reduce those experiences, the children absolutely want to know how. Absolutely.
And I know, like, again, from experience in schools, I used to always say, give them an out. If you see them starting to escalate, give them an out. Have envelopes in a drawer or something that you can say, oh, can you go give this to Mr. or Mrs. or whomever. If you see them escalating, say, did you want to go get a drink of water? Or I need to go do something, do you want to come with me? That kind of gives them an out so that they have privacy.
Absolutely.
In that moment.
Yeah. And I think recognizing those cues is so important too. Again, whether you're a caregiver, and maybe that's more strategies too, but but that's something that I think is important. Yeah.
We're psychotherapists. We always go to the strategy part. And have to bring it back around. And when you and I get talking, we usually. But I think understanding those misconceptions help with strategies, right?
Yeah.
If you know that a child is not typically going to do that to get attention. Do they sometimes? Yeah, they do. But typically speaking, children don't do that. Typically speaking, children don't want to look badly in front of their peers. You know, so as you said, use that as a cue.
Yeah, and I think, again, like being curious, not making an assumption that it's attention seeking, not making the assumption that it's because of blank, like being curious, like how come in this moment right now are they demonstrating this or that? Because that's going to help you learn about them, where they're at, and therefore support them.
That's right, because every individual is unique. And we can't paint anxiety with the same brush for every child.
Yeah.
So one may be shy and not want to talk to people and have like selective mutism, which is another form of. But and some children might be raging and they might be throwing things and they might be, or some may talk back, some may laugh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some may laugh in certain situations, and then we get on them for being inappropriate and laughing,
Mm-hmm.
and they can't stop. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
just a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
We have to learn that individual child.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now moving towards the root causes, understanding root causes, and there's a lot, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's three like main categories that we look at, like genetics,
Mm-hmm.
environment, and temperament.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk a little bit about, some genetics, like what that might look like?
Yeah. So like family history obviously has an impact. So not to say that if a parent or a grandparent has or experiences anxiety that the child would. However, they are kind of more likely to be predisposed to experiencing that as they move through life. And I think a piece with that too is that if parent or caregiver or the adults in the child's life demonstrate anxiety, sometimes that can be displayed or projected onto the child, and that can impact how they think or how they view themselves or others or the world around them. So that can be a layer in terms of the family dynamic and family history with that.
Yeah, I think that's that last part you touched on is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
When I used an example in a video I did, and that because it's something that I saw all the time.
Yeah.
And it's when our kids come home and they say that nobody would play with them.
Mm-hmm.
And right away we go back to grade 2 when I was alone on the playground and nobody would play with me and they made fun of me, and we project that onto our child. Like, what?
Mm-hmm.
You must have been so sad. You must have. And so often the child's like, no, I just went and did this, or I just played, or I saw it with the kids I worked with, but I see it with the adults that I work with, and they'll say something like, oh, my teenage daughter or whatever, girls can be so mean, and my first question I always ask is, how did she react to that situation? No, she's so strong, it didn't even bother her. So why are you making it bother her then? Right? And because that's what we do. We project that, our own traumas, our own... So that may be environmental, but it's also that genetic. And yes, they may have been born with a genetic predisposition because of history of mental health issues in the family, and you are triggering that part. So why create something that isn't there?
Yeah.
And I know it's hard. It's hard. Because we don't want our children to go through what we went through. Yeah. They're not. Sometimes they are.
Yeah.
But in some situations, they're not. They're not going through it. We're putting them through it.
And even if it is similar, it's different because it's them, and they are a different person than you.
Which leads me to the next one, temperament. I skipped one, but that was a good segue. It leads me to temperament.
Yeah.
Right? You can have 4 kids in a family, and same parents, and we can in another podcast talk about how parenting is different with children because they different ages and or like parents are different ages and stuff, but temperament plays a role in it. You could have a kid that's like whatever and a kid that's like whoosh, right? And I think we actually have that in almost every family.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? Like, what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good point and kind of a loaded topic there, but temperament definitely does play a factor. And I would also say like family structure. I know that's a little bit again different, but every child is different, therefore emotions are going to present differently, so anxiety, etc. And again, learning kind of how your child presents is really important to be able to then know how to help them. So it kind of goes back not making assumptions that if they're not displaying this, then that means they're A-okay, or if they are displaying this, then that means they're not okay. So yeah, not letting a child's temperament necessarily determine, I don't know how I want to say that, but understanding the child's temperament is going to be important for you to be able to adequately support them.
For sure. For sure. And yeah, family structure. Sibling roles. All of that do play a part in it. But you can have like my grandchildren, my grandson is you know, he gets in trouble and he's like, he's 4, and my granddaughter's just turned 3, and she gets in trouble and she's like, right? And, you know, she does the eye roll at 3. It's so, but it's just different temperament. They're raised by the same parents. They're, you know, and, you just have to, I mean, look how many videos and stuff are on social media saying, how come the second child's always, or the youngest child's always, right? Yeah. You know, we can go into that in another podcast, but it is temperament. Yeah. And then the environment, so like family stress, bullying, school systems, all of that. I think, not that any one of these is more prevalent than the other, because they all play a role, but environment, and some of that, you know, what I said about projecting, or what we said about projecting, is part of the environment too. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I agree with what you said. I think, you know, it's never just one thing. There's always many contributing factors. And I think one thing with the environmental factors is our environment is typically ever changing, right? Like in terms of family dynamics, potentially, conflict at home, schools. Like I know right now, something I'm seeing is with the education system, there's a lot of teacher changes throughout the year. So that is a really big stressor or activator for kids right now, because there's a new teacher, let's say, every month. So the environment's ever changing, and I had mentioned earlier, like that unpredictability is a big part in experiencing anxiety. So the environment, when there is those changes that we're maybe not prepared for, it can be really difficult to manage. And again, I think this is where, going back to understanding the child, because some children need a lot of preparation for those changes, if possible. We don't always have that option, where some are okay kind of just going with it, right? Or kind of finding out the day before, or that kind of thing. So I think, with the environment, it's recognizing that there's always those ongoing changes, and that's something that is hard for a lot of us. For sure. And one that I've seen, I mean, when I was growing up, if parents were separated, it was like, holy cow. Right now, if parents are still married, it's like, holy cow. And so a lot of kids are living in living out of a bag is what they often say to me, and rules and environment in the two households are not the same. And then there's blended families in there too, in the environment, right? And bringing other siblings, step siblings in and stuff like that. So that is huge. You know, it's really important to try to make that transition as smooth as possible. And again, a whole other podcast, but we can talk about co-parenting and consistency and stuff, and how inconsistency can create anxiety in a child, and oppositional defiance disorder. But it can create that anxiety in a child. Well, and like you said, kind of going back and forth and having to like essentially switch into whatever the expectations are for that environment is hard enough as adults. So for somebody who has a developing brain, or maybe other things going on, it can be really difficult. And that's typically when we see too, they need a bit of like a transition day or a decompression day, where they're going to switch and they're going to have some big emotions. They're going to feel the feelings because they're adapting to their new environment, and that's okay. And leaving the other parent. Exactly. Exactly. So, you know, there's that separation anxiety piece too. I won't get into all of that right now, because we can do a deep dive into it. Another good segue, because one thing I want to talk about too is like major life changes. And how that can impact a child. You know, like moving, starting a new school, especially, you know, the social aspect. And a lot of adults say it's hard to make friends. It's hard to make friends for kids. And, you know, one of my clients just shared to me yesterday her son playing soccer. And the other team, and he's only 8 years old, and the other team was like totally chirping them and saying that they're losers and stuff. And he's like, why would people say that, Mommy? Right? And there's always been chirping in sports. At 7 and 8 years old, I'm like, what? You know, so that social aspect, right? But major, how their equilibrium, you know, our equilibrium, what we know to be true and real, gets turned upside down. What do you notice
because you work with kids all the time, and there have been a lot of major changes in the world. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any major life change, there's stress attached to it, right? Whether it's moving homes, moving schools, changing jobs, what have you. One thing that I see is that there's a disruption to routine, right? And as humans, we like predictability, we like structure, we like routine, and kids need that. That's really important for them. And so when there's a change or a change coming up, that is going to be different. And that can create a sense of uncertainty, potentially make them feel unsafe, and that activates our stress response, right? Which then could encourage some of those symptoms of anxiety to come up, and some of those fight, flight, freeze behaviors to come up. And not to say like with a life change that it's going to be prolonged, but in that moment, because there is that uncertainty, the unpredictability, we haven't established that routine yet, they're going to demonstrate some of those things. And I also think too, like, here's another good example, how are the parents responding to those major life changes? If it is a changing in homes or schools, right? They're going to have their own feelings about it, totally fine. Yeah. But are they checking in to see what and how they're demonstrating those? Yeah,
because, being a parent, and you're going to experience this soon, you are going through the same thing. Not the same things, like everything's unique, but the move and stuff, and you're exhausted, and you're the one trying to organize everything, and sometimes you feel like you don't have any more energy to give. So if you are feeling that way, chances are your child's feeding off of it, because children, again, strategy-wise, but children look to us for a reaction. So because they might not know how to react in situations. Yeah. So if they're looking to us for a reaction, we're up here, they're up here, right? And then we react to that, and that's when it all escalates. Yeah. If children think that we're mad at them, it's going to trigger more anxiety. And so it's keeping that in check. And so I think one good thing, again, strategy, but one good thing to remember is gauge your own anxiety in a situation, your own distress, your own stress, and then look at your child. Yeah. Because they're seeing it, they're probably feeling it, and kids are pretty intuitive. Super intuitive. Yeah. Yeah. I often say, like, they have figured out what's going on before they've figured out what's going on. Yeah. Just based on those environmental pieces. Yeah. Yeah, and again, strategy. However, I tell parents all the time, be honest with your children at a level they understand. Yeah. Oftentimes, we try to protect our children. They know what's going on before they know what's going on. And then part of the underdeveloped brain is often what they perceive isn't accurate per se, right? And so their imagination goes, and what they think is going on with disordered anxiety can be worse than actually what's happening. So being honest at a level they understand. They don't need to know all the details. Yeah. They don't need to know the adult stuff. Yeah. What you tell your 14-year-old, you wouldn't tell your 5-year-old. So you know your child, know the anxiety levels, and try to give them some information. Absolutely. I think that builds like that rapport, and then also gives them a little bit of reassurance, right? Versus, everything's fine, and they know that it's not fine. So information, some context is helpful. Yeah. And, it's going to be okay for me because I'm just feeling anxious. It's going to be fine. Yep. Right? Yep. But it's going to be okay for me. I'm feeling anxious right now. Yeah. And tell them why. Yeah. Because then that normalizes it for them a bit too. Yeah. Right? Where, okay, mom's or dad's feeling anxious too. It's okay. And this is what mom and dad are doing. Instead of trying to, don't show emotion and suck it up and be the adult. Yeah. It's okay. It actually normalizes it for kids. Yeah. Yeah. And our next podcast is going to be about the messages kids receive, and how it formulates their narrative. And so if you do not show emotion to your child, if you do not say, I'm feeling anxious right now, or I'm feeling sad, the message they receive is that emotions are bad, and we shouldn't show emotions. We need to be tough, right? Yeah.
And I think that ties into, like, again, checking in, because how we display our emotions, kids pick up on that, right? So I often have parents coming to me like, how come they're doing this? Okay, well, how do you express that emotion,
Yeah.
right? So it's recognizing that they are watching you.
Absolutely.
So as caregivers, as adults in children's life, we have such a huge influence.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that because, interesting, because I think it was early 90s, maybe. I don't know. It was maybe early 2000s. I don't know. Anyway, it was a country song. And now it's like completely leaving my brain who sang it and everything. And he had his son in there. And it's about, I've been watching you, Daddy, and stuff. And like all of a sudden, and he's like, how did you learn to curse like that? Or how? And basically the kid wants to grow up to be just like him. And I remember that song, and I remember singing it and loving it. However, that child, so in the video was the country singer and his child, and I think he was probably 5, maybe younger. That child is now grown up, and they've redone the song, and he's singing it with the dad.
Oh my gosh.
And I've just seen it all over like social media and that kind of thing, and and that's exactly what the song's about.
Yeah.
Like when parents are like, where did you hear that?
Yeah.
Right? And, funny, my grandson kept saying, what the heck? Like that. And I showed up unexpected to pick him up at daycare one day, and he's like, what the heck, Grandma? And my son was like, why do you keep saying that? Quit saying that. And I was with him one day, and I can't remember what we were doing. I was like, what the heck? And also I'm like, So I texted my son, and I'm like, with the emoji with the hand up, what the heck? Me. That was me. And he just did the like,
Yeah. Yeah.
But you don't realize, I mean, what the heck, isn't that bad?
Yeah.
But you don't realize, we have to be careful of how we react, what we say, so many times I hear, I didn't know where it came from, and then all of a sudden I caught myself doing it. They pick up on it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, moving on then, I think it's good, like the emotions and talking how we react and that kind of thing, to move into what to look for, what parents should look for, different signs. And I know that we kind of separate them into like behavioral, emotional, and physical. And, behavioral, like avoidance is a huge one.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, refusing to go to school. Again, going back to that, I want to play soccer, and then getting to the field and refusing.
Yeah.
Avoidance is number one behavior for escape, and avoidance is number one behavior for anxiety, right? So, because your brain actually thinks you're coping because it doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It doesn't suck so much anymore, so I must be coping.
Yeah.
No, you're avoiding, that's why. So, if we don't work towards it, like avoiding dogs, avoiding that kind of thing, the what ifs, expressing that and seeking that reassurance and stuff. I assume what ifs are huge. They're huge for the adults I deal with, so I assume they're huge.
Even if they don't come in the form of the what ifs, it's the asking numerous questions about roughly the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. And again, it typically those questions are in attempt to avoid something like sleep. We often hear parents get fired with 100 questions before bed, but we're not wanting to sleep because maybe we're anxious about what's coming the next day, right? Or the monster in the closet, or whatever it might be for them. So we often see a lot of questions, right? Like, am I going to be okay? Is there anything? Can you check in the closet? Like, all of those statements. So even if it's not exactly the what ifs, you can tell their brain is stuck on, focused, ruminating on this particular stressor for them. Yeah,
that's a really good point. The adults are the what ifs, and kids are more the questions. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and the questions, and I need water. I need to go to the bathroom. Yeah, are you just going to be in bed? Are you just going? Yeah. Those are their what ifs. Yeah. What if I'm abandoned? What if you're not here? Yeah. What if I fall asleep and the monster gets me? Yeah. Whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's another thing too. Like, yes, avoidance, but then there's also looking for that reassurance or comfort. So again, sleep as an example. Can the parent lie with me while I fall asleep? Yeah. Will you come back? Will you tuck me in? And that's a way that children are expressing they're wanting that extra reassurance for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes we need to do the, you know, like school refusal and stuff like that. Most of the kids I used to work with would say, once I'm there, I'm okay. Anxiety is about the fear of the unknown. So it's what's going to happen, what if.
Yeah.
Because once I'm there, I'm like, let's do this thing.
Yeah, and their brain registers like it's familiar. I know this environment. I can navigate it. But when we're not there, that's when all those hypotheticals come up. Or like you said, their imagination creates then these scenarios.
Yeah. Another big one for behavior is withdrawal from activities, from social things. If you recognize that your child used to be really social and all of a sudden they're starting withdrawal, that could be an indication of many different things that are happening. So any kind of, my perspective, you can elaborate on a bit, but any kind of significant change in behavior with a child. Yeah. So a child that used to be social is no longer. A child that used to speak is no longer. You know, the child that used to sit quietly is now throwing things and yelling and hitting and stuff like that. Can indicate a lot of different things that we need to investigate the minute that happens. Can you talk a little bit about it, like with respect to the anxiety part?
So yeah, I agree. I think like any behavior that's atypical for the child is something we want to be curious about. And I think like speaking about the withdrawal specific to anxiety, right? We're not wanting to do something because there's that worry or concern that it's not going to be fun, it's going to be scary, it's going to be challenging, what have you, right? Like we talked about perfectionism earlier. I don't want to do it because what if I get it wrong? And that's really, really difficult to kind of wrap our head around. So that withdrawal could be for a lot of different reasons, and I think is definitely a barrier, because the more we avoid something, the more challenging it is to engage with it whenever we do choose to engage with it again.
Something came to mind when you said it and I just lost it, which is normal for me too. Yeah, it'll come back to me. The clinginess. Parents are like, I remember when my son was little, and I don't think it was separation anxiety, but it was kind of a developmental milestone. He was like 2 or something. And I was a solo parent. And so my friend just talked about this the other day. She goes, do you remember when Ryan was little? And like you couldn't even go to the bathroom. Like if I walked to even if my friends were there or my mom, I would walk to the bathroom and he'd be sitting crying, banging on the door because there was a door between us. That can weigh on a parent too. But that is a significant behavioral sign of anxiety. Depending on the age too. Like I said, there is the developmental. Many toddlers just, no, right? But do you see that a lot in your office now, like the clinginess?
Absolutely.
And is there a certain age group that it is like more concerning or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a really common thing that's reported by parents, and then you can also from children who are expressing that they just don't want to be away from their parents. So like a lot of transitions, whether that's going to school, whether that's transitioning from home to home, whether that's, again, nighttime routine. So that is something that's definitely experienced. Again, like you said, sometimes developmentally appropriate, depending. I would say, just in the last little bit, seeing it more so in 6, 7, 8-year-olds.
Oh, interesting.
Where, you know, they've gone through a stint, let's say, where they've been able to sleep independently, and now they're really demonstrating that clinginess in terms of either needing to be in bed with the parent, or, you know, wanting to go to the grocery store with the parent, or whatever it might be. And in that case, again, it's atypical because they have been able to do the thing independently. And at that age, we're not really anticipating that would be a developmental marker, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that clinginess is definitely a significant piece. And again, I think that's where, like you said, it really weighs on the parents, and then parents can start to feel a certain way about it, and then they might get frustrated or become annoyed, and totally fair. However, that then also kind of piggybacks on top of the anxiety too, because now I'm concerned about my caregiver's reaction.
Absolutely, and creates shame. And they don't know why they're feeling that way either, right? And using terms like toughen up and stuff like that is not what we want to say to them in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that part of the developmental stage is developmental fears, and around that time sometimes there is a fear of like fire, or there is a fear of being taken and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what you're describing is more extreme. Yeah. It's not the like, can you just stay with me for a bit, or
yeah. And it's the distress that comes from not being near that person, or not being able to access that person, right? Where I think like with those developmental pieces, it's they're wanting that feedback, and when they're exposed to it, it helps with that regulation. But in this case, they can be exposed to it, but it's still the distress that comes from like, when are they going to be back, or like again the what ifs, right?
Yeah. Which then leads to the next thing, which is temper tantrums, or emotional. That's emotional too, but it's also physical, or behavioral. So the outbursts and that kind of thing, where they might be throwing stuff, they may lash out, they may, as you said, behavior is communication for kids. It's about something, and so if you think about anxiety, and they're feeling completely helpless, hopeless, whatever it happens to be, panicked. We get angry. The anger is going to come out to protect them, and so they can't regulate though, and that's when you're going to get the temper tantrum. I can't say that today. Temper tantrum. Yeah. So, did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like it goes into that again disproportionate kind of response, and then we see these. And I think that ties into like those emotional indicators, right? Of like, I'm not able to regulate. I recognize something's wrong. I'm not able to figure out what I need or how to communicate it. So that now I'm kind of communicating in a more extreme way to try and get some kind of feedback, whether it's the reassurance or the comfort or what have you. And I think that kind of ties into like recognizing some of these signs is going to reduce the likelihood of there being this significant temper tantrum, right? And I sometimes equate it, I know it's not quite the same, but like in adults, when we feel that anxiety and it really, really elevates, it can escalate to a panic attack, right? And so in a child, they feel that anxiety, and if it really, really escalates, we see this like meltdown.
For sure.
So it's like that extreme kind of body going off, like alarm clock kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I never actually looked at it that way, but that's a great way to explain it. Yeah. I mean, kids have panic attacks too. However, it's a really good way to, and also, I mean, adults, I've seen many adults when they're feeling anxious go off. Yeah. We're not saying that every time a child has a temper tantrum, it's, I've had a situation again with my grandson, but when he was a toddler, he was about 20 months old, and he must have learned this somewhere. He wanted to try to get into the cupboard under the sink, and I was like, nope, we're not doing that. And he literally walked over to the middle of the kitchen, lay down on the floor, very controlled, and then started crying and begging. And I'm like, oh, where did you see that? So I walked away. I said, no, Grandma's not playing that game today. And as soon as I walked away, he and followed me. That's different than a child having anxiety, because the reason I'm clarifying this is because I hear it all the time. Right? If they're having a temper tantrum, I'm just leaving them there. Okay, but if it's an anxiety-driven temper tantrum and we want to, it just triggered it in me because you said that we need to equate it to like an adult panic attack. If someone's having a panic attack, the last thing they need to hear is, figure it out on your own, I'm not dealing with it. And that's the message that we give a child if they're having this emotional outburst, if they're having the tantrum. Why can't I say that today? When they're having the tantrum, I'm just leaving you there. No, they can't regulate.
Yeah. And I think a good difference with that too is like with your grandson, you knew what he was wanting.
Absolutely.
Right? Where not often, but typically with individuals, when they're experiencing anxiety, the parents are like, why are they demonstrating this tantrum? Why are they having this emotion? So it's kind of distinguishing that too.
Absolutely. And part of knowing the child, if, I mean, the example I gave, it was very controlled. However, even if you don't know what it is, just going over and sitting with them on the floor, giving them a hug and saying, it's okay. and breathing with them. This is what I do when I'm feeling overwhelmed. Breathe with them, get them to calm down, and then discuss.
Yeah.
If they're in trouble because they did something, then that's when you discuss the discipline or whatever, right? Not leaving them there or getting angry with them and telling them, you need to toughen up, you're not getting away with this, right? Again, we can deep dive into that kind of thing too, but I think it just goes in understanding your child's behaviors.
For sure.
And changes.
Yeah.
And perfectionism is in there. Procrastination and perfectionism.
Yeah.
And we often tell kids they're being lazy when they're procrastinating. And procrastination and anxiety.
Well, procrastination's avoidance.
Exactly. And so if a child is thinking everything has to be perfect, that's overwhelming. And sometimes they're processing it. And it looks like procrastination too.
Yeah.
But it's avoiding.
Yeah. And I think too, like, again, given the child, if that's the route that they're taking, that's okay. Like, they need that extra time to process. They need to work through those feelings. So even though it's not how we would do it, and maybe it's making us feel anxious, it doesn't mean it's wrong.
That's right.
Yeah.
I always use the term not right or wrong, just different.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And when I'm treating adults too, you know, the way he does it and the way you do it doesn't mean one or she and she or he and you, whatever it happens to be, doesn't mean that it's they're right, you're wrong, or vice versa. It means it's just different.
Yeah, exactly.
And so same with kids.
Yeah.
Just because they don't do it, they're our kid, they should do it the way we're doing it. Nope.
Nope. They're a different person.
Okay, so, other things are trouble sleeping, frequent nightmares, that kind of thing. If that's coming up because your brain processes memories, unconscious thoughts, and subconscious thoughts and everything in our sleep. So if they're nightmares, their brain might be processing some of that anxiety too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then moving to emotional indicators, we have touched upon some of them with the behavioral ones because they do kind of go hand in hand, right? Like the emotional, the outburst, and that kind of thing. And I often use the term, does the response fit the event? And so if your child is, it's kind of like, does the punishment fit the crime?
Yeah.
Right? If the child goes to do up their zipper and it's a full-on meltdown, we need to investigate that a little bit if it becomes a pattern of behavior.
Yeah. And I think sometimes with those pieces, it's not actually about the zipper, right? Like, it's maybe all the other things that have happened throughout the day or the thing we're thinking about that's coming up. So also, too, as adults in a child's life, not making the assumption that we're having the meltdown because the zipper won't go up.
Yeah.
Right? That could just be the last, like, little ounce we had in our cup.
That's right. Yeah, you're making really good points. I didn't even think about it. And that's why you're my right-hand lady. If a child, again, atypical behavior, I often say too, so not about that zipper. Or, again, treating adults. Okay, but it wasn't about that, was it? Again, just because they're children doesn't mean they don't have those tipping points. And so if that's atypical behavior, sitting down and saying, what's up? What's going on? Let's talk about this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not necessarily just what's going on.
Yeah.
But let's go through your day. How was the morning? Because sometimes kids don't know why.
Yeah.
We don't know why.
Yeah.
For ourselves sometimes. The kids don't know why.
Yeah.
But once you go through their day and it's like, oh yeah, so-and-so called me a name and the teacher made me do something over again and, nobody played with me at recess and that kind of thing, we understand the zipper.
Exactly. I think, giving them the space to reflect and think about their day. Because school's a lot. It's busy. There's lots going on. There's lots of demands placed on them. There's the social aspect, academics, athletics, all the things. And they need time to think about their day. And sometimes, like, when we get home from work, right? Also, the other thing, maybe a little off topic here, but...
it's okay. I told you, we always do that.
But hungry.
Yeah.
And water. And, if they haven't slept very well, like, those could be things that are filling their cup. So then we don't have the capacity for the zipper. Right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't necessarily mean anxiety, but we want to learn. We want to understand. We want to have conversations with our children.
For sure. And, what we know about vulnerable emotions and anger and stuff like that comes out, if we are fatigued, if we're hungry, if we're sick, it exacerbates anxiety.
For sure.
Emotional distress.
Yeah.
And so, it's about looking at all of those things. And, you may be tired at the end of the day, too. However, weigh the difference. I put in the time now and I figure this out, and then I start dinner and everything else I have to do, or I just let it go on, and then bedtime is now 2 hours later, and the whole house is in chaos. Right? Yeah. So I think we touched about a lot of the emotional, just fear that seems very irrational.
Yeah.
The trigger points, the quick to anger, the meltdowns, irritability, that snappy, especially teenagers. Because then we get the hormones going in there too. If you really look at the stress response, emotional dysregulation is part of it, because it's within, the parts of your brain that kind of shut off, and when you're really anxious. And so if you can't regulate those emotions, and irritability, I always say to clients, is number one. If you're feeling anxious, irritability, everyone just gets on your last nerve. Your capacity.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then physical. So I want you to talk about some of the physical that you see, that and one I just want to add in at the beginning is bladder issues and bowel issues. Like, kids often say stomach ache, headache, because if you go through the stress response and you see all the different things that happen during the stress response, they may describe it as a stomach ache. Our stomachs relax. Your brain wants your body to remove anything that's in it, so that it can focus on these muscles, right? Your legs, your arms, muscles that can help you escape or fight back. And so bladder, I've had some parents talk about how their kids leak, right? And that they've had multiple physical examinations, tests at CHEO, and they can't find anything physical. No, because it's anxiety, and your bladder's relaxing, or bowel movements and soiling themselves, or running to the washroom, or that kind of thing. And with adults, I describe how in movies, scary movies, not that I watch them very often, but scary movies, and then all of a sudden they show like the person urinating on themselves, right? Like, it gets dark down there. That's actually accurate, because your bowel can give away, it relaxes. And so for kids too, if you start to see that kind of stuff happening, or they say, I think I have the flu, obviously they may have the flu, but look into that too. That's a physical response.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, like whether it's kind of going to the washroom a lot or not being able to. And I think for everybody, right, like our gut and our brain are so connected. They communicate all of the time. So if we're feeling that stress, that directly impacts how our gut is going to respond. And I think even too, like when we say like sore stomach, like some children and some adults can physically be sick.
Absolutely.
Because they're so anxious, or their stress level is so high. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's the flu. It could.
Yeah.
But again, being curious, because there could be some other
for sure
pieces.
For sure. And kids are going to describe it at a kid level.
Yeah.
We might say, oh, I feel nauseous and my stomach feels like it just flipped. Kids are going to say, my stomach hurts.
Yeah.
My tummy hurts.
Yeah.
Oh, my head, the pressure in my head, which is another part of the stress response. Kids are going to say, my head hurts. So, yeah, those are clear signs that, let me regroup a little bit, continuation of those.
Yeah.
If it's a one-off.
Yeah, and again, atypical to what they usually report, and generally if there's patterns, right? Like if it's coming up every other day at school, or every time before I go to swimming, or whatever. Yeah. So that's another thing to be
for sure of. So what are your thoughts on, we've talked a lot about looking at the signs, change in typical behavior, those kinds of things. What are your feelings on early intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. Early intervention is, I feel, key the earlier the better. Again, it doesn't mean we're going to take away the anxiety, and I think that's one thing, like, that's not necessarily the goal. However, the goal is to reduce the intensity and the frequency of that emotional distress for the child. And so recognizing the signs is a big part of being able to intervene early. And not to say you can't be successful and supportive and helpful for the child when they are in that 10 out of 10 space, but it's more difficult. It's more exhausting, and we don't necessarily want the child to be going through that level of escalation. So early intervention is really, really important, and it also helps the child develop like comfort and confidence with recognizing their own signs and recognizing I can feel better, I can halt this, or I can do something about it. Where when we're going into these extremes, it can feel really overwhelming for the child, and they feel like there's no other kind of option.
Yeah, and that's why we are emphasizing what to watch for, right? Because as soon as you start to see that pattern of atypical behavior, we need to, and I would say, obviously, to get that child some help, they may need some extra help, but also, number one thing, when you start to see those atypical behaviors, talk to your child. Yeah. Ask them what they're experiencing. Yep. And then the next thing I always say is sit with your child and breathe. Yep. Because, I've mentioned before, so often we say, you need to take a breath. You need to breathe. And they're like, right? We need to just sit and breathe with them. That's going to lower, it's going to get the signal to the prefrontal cortex so that we can help them through those things. Yeah. Right out of the gate. Yeah. And then we start to work on more strategies and get them in to see a therapist, a counselor, right? One thing that, throughout my career in education, working in education as a behaviorist and a counselor, and so I dealt with a lot of kids on the spectrum, but a lot of kids with ADHD. That was a big component of what I did. And I know, and they're doing more studies now, and we're going to do another podcast on that and do a deep dive into it, because I have a lot of adult female clients with this. The way that ADHD presents in females as opposed to males, often it presents as anxiety. So there's that, but also anxiety and ADHD can be comorbid. And a question I get asked all the time, and I did pick out some of the differences and similarities of the two, but one thing I get asked all the time is, how do I know if it's ADHD or anxiety? And often teachers would say to me, I think they have ADHD. And right away I would say, what's going on at home? What's going on at school with them, like socially and stuff? Because emotional distress, anxiety, can have a lot of the same characteristics. It can feel the same way. Can't focus, can't concentrate, executive functioning issues. I have some that I did write down because I'm not going to memorize all of them. What information would you give parents to distinguish between anxiety and ADHD?
Yeah, so I think this is a good question. It's tough because there is so much overlap, and we can get into this kind of like chicken or the egg sort of scenario.
Comorbidity.
Yeah. I think one thing to keep in mind is that ADHD symptoms are typically present across all environments. Not to say that anxiety symptoms can't be as well. However, ADHD symptoms are typically present at home, at school, at extracurriculars, so you're probably going to get some of that feedback not just from teachers, but maybe from other people involved in the child's life. And whereas anxiety is likely more activated in certain environments, wherever that kind of distress is, or around certain people, let's say. And it doesn't, I think the other kind of difference too is that the anxiety doesn't necessarily mean, how do I want to phrase this? The anxiety can develop based on experiences or exposure to certain things, where symptoms of ADHD would likely have been present throughout the child's life.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's more, ADHD is that neurodivergent. There's something, executive functioning. Anxiety can be because of something. ADHD normally presents in ADHD stems from childhood up, right? Stems from, it's lifelong.
Yeah.
And to the point where one of the criteria of ADHD was present before the age of 12.
Yeah.
And anxiety, a child can be this happy-go-lucky, into everything, social butterfly until the age of 10, and all of a sudden, or 8, or let's just use that as an example. Or 15, or, so anxiety doesn't necessarily have to be present in childhood. And I know that, anxiety is that excessive worry, that ADHD isn't it's executive functioning. A child with ADHD can develop anxiety because of the changes and the differences and not being able to slow your brain down and your marks and all of that. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, like, anxiety can be situational depending on what's going on in the child's life. And I think the other thing too that I often talk with parents about, because sometimes it's like, what is it? And really, we also want to look at, like, what are the symptoms? Because that's what we want to strategize. That's what we want to support, regardless of if it's ADHD or anxiety. That's the primary motivator.
Yeah. I use that often too. That, I think that especially nowadays, people want. People say, I don't want to have a label. I don't want to be labeled, but they want a label.
Yeah.
Right? People want to know a reason.
Yeah.
They want to know, and I often say that too. Okay, but regardless if it's a diagnosis or if it's just something that the child is going through, let's treat what they're going through. Let's treat those symptoms regardless.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, good talk. Good talk. I have my trusty cue cards because you know how my ADHD brain works, right? So just moving on to strategies. I want to, obviously, the strategies are very important, and those are what parents and adults ask us all the time to look into. So I do want us to dive into them. But I know how you and I are. And this podcast could end up being like 4 hours long. So, because we've been talking for a while now, let's just kind of go over some of the strategies that I know that you and I've done presentations at schools and daycares and stuff like that for parents. And so what are some of the things that you would suggest to a parent? So your client comes in, anxiety. What are some strategies that you would share with the parent? Let's do parent first.
Okay. So, yeah. First of all, I think we've kind of highlighted this in this conversation, but like, know the child's warning signs, I think, is a huge one. Again, to be able to kind of support and intervene. A big thing I talk about with almost every set of parents is it's going to be very important to try and provide the validation, the reassurance, and the active listening versus trying to problem solve or fix. Because as parents, we don't want to see our kids in distress. We want to try and help them, of course, but sometimes they're not looking for a fix. They don't want a solution. They just want to be heard. Absolutely. So that idea of validation, reassurance, active listening, again, even if we don't understand or agree, just providing them with that space can make a big difference, and setting time aside to do so.
For sure.
Because life can get really busy, and it's hard sometimes for the child to feel like they can talk to the parent if they're busy cooking dinner or whatever. So setting aside 5-10 minutes every day, every other day, just to check in, can go a long way. So that's something I usually talk with parents about. The other thing too is like predictability. So, being able to provide your child with like visuals. So whether it's a visual schedule, visual timer, a calendar, and include them in that, right? Like, make it fun, make it interesting for them so that they kind of can get their own reassurance, versus always having to go to the adults in their life. Sure. I think is a big one as well. Again, for parents, a lot of like being mindful of your response. So really checking in with yourself. How are you responding? What do you need? What are you modeling? In terms of if you're feeling anxious, that's fine. Take a moment to reset. then the child's going to recognize that and also want to take a moment to reset potentially. So I do a lot of parent education in terms of just managing their own emotions with it and not making assumptions, not kind of like trying to respond versus react. So take that extra couple of moments before engaging with the child. And if you are in a 2-parent household, if you need a timeout, like tag the other one in, that's okay. Recognizing when you need those breaks. And kind of on top of that is modeling, like, and I know you referenced earlier, but like, I feel frustrated right now. I feel anxious right now. Like, let the child know how you're feeling. Because again, it normalizes it, and it also shows like you're human. You're going to have some emotions too, and that's totally okay.
Absolutely.
So being able to practice expressing that, and you getting comfortable with that, because if you're going to talk to your child about emotions, you need to be
comfortable with your emotions.
Comfortable with your emotions, exactly.
For sure. You know, one strategy I used to do with kids is a worry jar.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, many kids have devices and stuff that they could use as well. But a worry jar that every day was freak out time, or, you know, like we'd have like different names. One kid called it freak out time. So I started doing that. But, and I do it with adults too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Set aside a time during the day. And sometimes when the child can write down, you know, the worry that they have during the day, it gives it a place.
Yeah.
Whether it's on their phone, in a jar, in their pencil case, whatever. And then when you meet with the child and you pull it out, sometimes it's like, oh no, that's okay now. And so then it's a good teachable to say, okay, so when that anxiety comes up, right, and that's what I do with clients as well, adults or children, when that anxiety comes up, you can say, oh, use it as a memory card. The last time I felt that way, it actually worked itself out, or this is what I did.
Yeah.
To change it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they forget.
Yeah.
that was even an anxious thought.
Yeah.
But it also gives time to work through it. And another thing that I had an adult client, and he shared that the strategies I would give him, like any worksheets and stuff like that, after dinner they would sit as a family with the kids and they'd go over the strategies, so the whole family was doing the strategies.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, wow.
Yeah.
That is amazing. And it normalizes it. Instead of that one child has anxiety and we need to do those strategies, the whole family's using it because everybody needs emotional regulation.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, I thought that was so cool. And now I share it with, you know, do it as a family. And every time I say that to an adult, because often the adults that I see will say, oh, I need to get my daughter in here. I need to get my son in here. They're experiencing it. And so I say, the strategies I'm teaching you, share it. Yes, they might need their individual therapy, but share it. Do it as a family.
For sure.
How cool is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that to build resilience in a child, we need to balance structure and flexibility. So they need to have structure, and then we need to teach them how to be flexible as well.
Yeah.
You know, okay, so let's say this changes. What's the worst thing that can happen? What's the best thing that can happen? And talk them through that.
Absolutely, and letting them know what they can use if they start to feel anxious about that change, right? Because there are things that are going to change, and that's okay, and it's okay to feel anxious about it, but this is what we can use. Like you said, whether it's the worry jar, whether we're just like externalizing in some way, draw it out, talk it out, whatever it might need to be, but letting them know like there's ways you can manage it.
For sure, which goes into the next thing. We just talked about what parents can do. That supportive environment, talking through it, the emotions, the structure, the flexibility, all of that. What are some strategies that you teach the children, your actual clients?
Yeah.
What strategies do you teach them?
Yeah. So again, I think there's so many different pieces here. For a lot of kids, I generally start with that awareness. So like, let's get doing some check-ins of some sort, right? Like, where are we on a scale of 0 to 10, or like zones of regulation, or an emoji chart, whatever it might be, so that they know, okay, if I'm a 5 or higher, I need a tool. And then I generally encourage children and parents to develop like a toolbox. And so that toolbox includes a bunch of different strategies. So when the child is starting to feel dysregulated, they can go to that box and grab something out of there. Because sometimes when we're really elevated or we're starting to escalate, it's hard to think of those things, hard to remember the strategies. So if it's all in one area, that makes a huge difference. And things that could go in that toolbox could be, like pen and paper to write or draw. Could be like sensory stimulation. So, some individuals respond really well to certain fidgets or a certain taste or smell, or like even just something to focus our energy on for a couple of moments. So like the water timers or hourglass, like something like that, as well as some different, I often talk with families and children, we develop different cards. So whether it has like emotion cards on it, whether it has like grounding exercises, so it could be like an I Spy game, or it could be like picking an object in the room and trying to describe it in as much detail as you can, just to again focus our energy on something different. So that's kind of a general starting point, is like have the check-ins so that they're developing that emotional awareness and getting confident with knowing what each level feels like, and knowing when to use an intervention. And if we have them all in one spot, easy access, they can use a couple, they can use one. And the other kind of layer to that is I often encourage too for children to find a space in their home where they would feel comfortable going to use those strategies, because sometimes home is very busy. So whether it's their room or a quiet corner or a spot in the basement or what have you, so like a spot that they can go to reset.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways we can teach kids to breathe. There's the 5-finger breathing where it's like inhale, exhale, pause. There's the figure 8 breathing in the middle, inhale going up, exhale going down, box breathing, inhale, hold, exhale, hold. There's so many different ways that we can, sometimes I just say, breathe in through your nose till you can't anymore, breathe out through your mouth till you can't anymore, just to simplify it.
I just want to add something in there too with the breathing. Sometimes with young kids, a couple of things I talk about is we do like a wood chopper breath. So if they stand up and they bring their arms over their head as they breathe in, and then they chop the wood on the way out.
Cool.
So it's like movement, breathing. Another thing I use with young kids too is squeeze and wait. So if they put their hands together, press their palms, link their fingers, and squeeze as hard as they can, and then take a break. Puts all of that extra energy into their hands and their palms versus like a busy brain or restlessness. So I tend to use that for younger individuals, but
that's cool. That's cool. And and that can also go in with the muscle relaxation. Right? There's describing, there was a program, I used to use it in the school system, and one of the things was spaghetti toes. And they talk about spaghetti being rigid before it's cooked. And after it's cooked, it's like warm spaghetti lying on your plate. And they go up the child's body, and it's like, tense it up and then relax it, tense it up. For me, I find progressive muscle relaxation difficult, I think, because I can't sit still that long. But what I do is I tense all my muscles up and then I slowly relax them, right? And I think that that's something to teach kids too. There's so many different strategies. And then I know, in the psychotherapy realm of it, then you start to do some childhood CBT and so it's about the relaxation, the calming strategies, the decompressions, and then let's challenge some of those thoughts and in a child level. Remember when I was in education and someone said to me, you can't do CBT with kids? And I'm like, yeah, you can. Friends for Life program that we used to do in the schools was CBT for kids, right? You don't have to talk about intrusive thoughts, and you talk about red thoughts, green thoughts, hot thoughts, cool thoughts, like you do it at a child level, but you can absolutely do it. And so then I assume that once you teach it to the child, with the child's permission, obviously depending on age, you share it with the parents, like the CBT stuff that you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's my general goal, is that, strategies are going to be able to be shared with the parents or caregivers, because they're the people who are with the child and can encourage it or model it or those kinds of things. So yeah, with the child's permission, I often encourage that strategies do be shared with parents when possible.
A question that I'm sure I get all the time, in my personal life, not in here obviously, because once they're in here, they're already here. When should a parent get their child help?
Ooh.
When should they seek counseling or therapy, psychotherapy?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think there's any wrong time to do that. There's a lot of benefits from therapy and just having an external spot to talk about or work through anything. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there has to be any particular reason or time when you can use that support. I guess a general kind of guideline, like if the parent is noticing again these atypical behaviors and feeling that they are maybe unable to support the child or don't have the tools or strategies, that's a good time to access the external supports. Sometimes children ask, so listen to them. If they want somebody to talk to, if they ask, absolutely, that's a great time to kind of utilize that as well. Sometimes feedback from third parties, if they're noticing something at school or extracurriculars, that might be another kind of opportunity to exercise that support. But I would say to parents, like, at any point it could be utilized, and it doesn't have to be long term. It can be to work through a situation. It can be, just to gain some tools, again, confidence, comfort level for the child and the parents to navigate something. So yeah, I would encourage at any point.
Yeah, I think that kids today, children and youth, have such an advantage over, like, especially the Gen Xers, right? There's a reason why there's so many Gen Xers in therapy now. But when I was growing up, like I said, I had social anxiety, and the messages I received were, don't be so sensitive, suck it up, life's hard. Yeah, life's hard, wear a helmet, like stuff like that. We were told, and we didn't have psychotherapists. We had childhood psychologists. We had, but to go to a psychologist, there must be something really wrong, right? So kids now, the advantage they have, well, first of all, they're so well versed in mental health, and they are asking to see a therapist, which I think is so cool.
Yeah.
And they hopefully, but what I see is they're helping to remove the stigma. I think that learning skills at a young age that are going to help you into adulthood to manage anxiety. Maybe there isn't a whole lot of significant anxiety now. Maybe a child saying there's this thing going on at school, can you bring me to get help for that? Those skills that you teach the children, and I know how fabulous you are at teaching the children these skills, is going to transcend into other areas of their life and into adulthood.
It can be proactive, exactly.
Absolutely.
So that they have something in their toolbox for when something comes up, because we're all going to experience pockets of anxiety and stress, and that's totally okay, but we want our children to be equipped.
Yeah. I think that's huge.
Yeah.
Right. And I had a friend say to me that her son in therapy, and her ex-husband said to him, he was 13 I think at the time, or 14, I'll pick you up, and then I'll go pick up your friend, because they were having a sleepover or something. And the kid's like, why would you do that? Why would you come into town and then go back out to the country and then come back into town? And the dad said, well, because you're at therapy, so I don't want to pick him up first. And the kid's like, he knows I'm in therapy. I don't care. Everybody does. Everyone's in therapy, right? And I was like, yes. Because in what she said to me was like, I think that more adults need to learn from our kids that it's not a scary thing, but I mean, growing up, the messages that we received in movies and stuff like that was like, think about some of the movies from the 70s and 80s that had to do with mental health. They're all horror films, right? So anyway, I think that, that's great advice. Proactive, and if you're seeing these. People ask me what are some things they can do, like different apps and stuff, and I just did a little research on some apps. I know that we have used Headspace, and there's Calm app, which is an adult app for meditation and sleep, but they have a children's section on it. So I just kind of looked them up. Full disclosure, I haven't used them, so I'm just different research I did on #1 recommended apps for kids, that kind of thing. There's like coloring apps. When we talk about distraction, it means to slow things down to get the signal here.
Yeah.
One thing I have on my phone, I actually have a book in here somewhere that when a client's starting to have a panic attack or anything, I will bring it out. And I started doing with my grandson too, is spot the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're doing spot the difference, you're so focused on trying to find the difference that the signal's getting into your prefrontal cortex because you're not thinking
Yeah.
about the stressor. And if you think about what EMDR is when your eyes are moving back and forth, there is a significance there too,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And calming. And so that's something that we do. Also, I'm not promoting any author or anything like that. However, the series of books that we have for CBT for kids, the what to do when,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the what to do if,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like what to do when mistakes make you quake,
Mhm.
what to do when your worries are too much,
Yeah,
what to do when your temper flares. Those
Yeah.
are fabulous books
absolutely.
that when I was working with kids I used all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They're cognitive behavior therapy books that you can get off, you know,
Mhm.
different places
Mhm.
that parents can purchase themselves.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's nice because those are stories with exercises and activities in them.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. So at the end of every podcast, we're going to do questions that we get from, you know, viewers, things that people ask us all the time. And so I have a few here. The first one is, can children grow out of anxiety? I have my thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's important to recognize like everybody experiences anxiety. We did talk about earlier in this podcast, like anxiety can be situational. So the things contributing to the anxiety can shift or change. Their ability to manage, recognize it can shift or change. I wouldn't necessarily say the statement they could grow out of it is accurate. However, they can learn to identify it, manage it, be able to kind of recognize it as they go forward. And again, recognizing like some of those environmental pieces could shift or change, which could also impact the child's experience with anxiety.
Exactly. So many people say they'll just grow out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a phase they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
No. If it's disordered anxiety, no.
Mm-hmm.
Can they manage it? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Does it maybe look like they grow out of it? Maybe. Do they mature and does their brain become developed? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they grow out of it though, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could have the skills that we teach them. They could have grow into the maturity.
Mm-hmm.
Their brain could be fully developed. They might
Mhm.
not have the same anxiety at 10 that they have at 30.
Mm-hmm.
However, you usually have the underlying things, right? I've had this social anxiety my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Is it mostly managed now? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But do those thoughts still pop in sometimes? The same ones I had when I was 9, 10 years old?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I just have the skills
Yeah.
to do it, right? So I think we need to stop looking at it as a phase, a
Mhm.
stage,
Mhm.
something they're going to grow out of.
Mm-hmm.
It's something they can be treated for.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's disordered anxiety,
Yeah.
not regular anxiety like you
Yeah.
were talking about, or
Yeah.
situational.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. One of the questions was, how can I help my child cope with anxiety? And I think that we've covered that in the podcast with a lot of strategies. What should I avoid saying to an anxious child? I think we've touched upon that a little
Mhm.
bit. However, I think that for me, and you may differ and you can share that, for me, I think one of the main things we need to avoid saying is, you're being silly and it's going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said that a
Mhm.
few times. I did a video about that. Because
Mm-hmm.
I hear it all the time,
Mhm.
right? And I think the other thing that I hear people saying all the time, in my personal life, obviously not in, well, I've heard it in here sometimes, but is, you really need to toughen up.
Mm.
You need to get thicker skin.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about that. Toughening up is not changing
Yeah.
those intrusive thoughts in your head that convince you that something terrible is going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Things that adults should avoid saying to kids.
Yeah, so I agree with all of what you said. Like, avoid any dismissive statements, right? Like, just get over it, let it go, it'll be fine. Like, any of those statements. So, again, like, trying to be curious versus make an assumption or judge judge.
Yeah.
Those would be a couple of statements.
Yeah. And I think, going back, this popped in my head, going back to when we were talking about like not projecting your anxiety onto your children, you can create anxiety in them. Also, if you know you have an anxious child, I think being careful of what you say, being careful of what you talk about around that child. If you have a child with generalized anxiety who is worried about the state of the world, and you start talking about, did you hear what Trump said, or did you hear what happened here, or did you hear what, that child is, that's going to increase their anxiety. Also, if you know that your child experiences issues with, I'll use the example I used before, the recess thing, right? And you're like, okay, I can't project my stuff onto them. Also, don't downplay it and say, oh, I know, that feels really bad, but, right? You also don't want to dismiss in that to try to not project. You can say things like, that happened to me when I was a child too, and I understand how that felt for me, and talk about it, see how it feels with for the child. Instead of like going all in or going all out.
Yeah.
It can be something that I experience that. Sometimes that connection too is like, oh.
For sure.
Right? I'm not alone in this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when in doubt, ask questions.
Yeah.
Right? Like ask them.
And the last question, again, kind of goes into what we've talked about, but how can I manage my own stress while supporting my child? And I think that we've touched on that a lot, but managing your own stress, know your triggers as well, know your own levels of anxiety, do your own stress management techniques, and don't project onto children. And also understanding that if they could, they would. I used to use that all the time when working with kids, with adults. If they could, they would. If they could go and just run out on that field, they would. If they could just get out of the car or get off the bus or get on the bus or whatever, they would. Understanding those things. But I think managing your own stress and changing your own perceptions of what anxiety is.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head with all of those pieces. Like really being self-aware and being mindful of what you model.
When you're feeling irritable, when you're feeling stressed, take the step back. Like you said, if it's a 2-parent household.
Yeah.
I often talk about removing the target, right? If you feel yourself getting up here, you are not the one to be addressing the child's anxiety in that moment.
Yeah.
And it's okay if, like, I was a solo parent household, so sometimes I would have to say, you know what, bud?
Yeah.
Mom just needs a break for a second. And sometimes I would say, I'm starting to feel up here. Sometimes my eye would twitch, and that's a joke we have now. I remember seeing that eye twitch a few times. That wasn't his anxiety, though.
Yeah.
That was being a teenage boy. But yeah, recognizing when you need to take the step back as well.
Yeah, and that it's okay to take that step back.
And it's actually teaching them that they can take a step back.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that we're going to wrap up. We've touched on a lot today. I think it's really good. I learned some stuff from you. I think some takeaways: recognizing your own triggers, talking to your child, normalizing emotions, communicating emotions, recognizing any atypical behaviors in your child, a change in behaviors, not just for anxiety, but like I said, it can mean a lot of different things if you see these changes. And teaching breathing, relaxation, calming. And I think for parents, if I could give them a number one thing, be patient. Be patient and understanding, and reach out and get some help. Educate. Educate yourself on what anxiety is and what your child's all about. Yeah. We often think we know our children. Do we? Because we know them, but do we? Right? So really get to know them. Yeah. And so I encourage our listeners to utilize some of these strategies. Sit down with your child and, as you said, ask them questions. Does this stuff scare you? Does this stuff? Sometimes they'll be like, yeah, that really scares me. We're like, it does? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Knowledge is power. And if you have that knowledge, you can be proactive. Right? Okay. I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice, often we're in a very busy private practice, and often it's like, hey Jade, how you doing? Good, Christine, how are you doing? And it's like, do. And when we are able to have those times that we sit down and just like this, we do think a lot alike. So thanks, and I'm going to have you back.
Okay, sounds good.
Because we have a lot to do with kids and teens. And I also want to have you back when we talk about some trauma.
Yeah,
some EMDR.
sounds good.
You may have a baby in your arms sometimes when I bring you in the fall, but I won't make you come to work, I promise. All right, so thanks for listening. Our next podcast next week, next week, is going to be the messages that we receive as children and how that forms our narrative as an adult. And a narrative that can be changed, but digging into that, it's pretty interesting. Well, I am a psych geek. I find it interesting, but many people I talk to about it, they don't realize not just verbal messages, but all messages. So we're going to talk about that. All right, I will see you next week, and take care of you.